now for my number 5 spot, I have Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. And this may surprise many people, as I really surprised myself with this one, as this is one of the main films I was for some reason the least interested in revisiting. But ultimately, it's a really fun sequel, mostly owed to Kane Hodder's first appearance as Jason Voorhees. I was just particularly entertained by Jason in this one. This film follows Tina, a teenager who has telekinetic powers, who accidentally frees Jason from his chains that Tommy Jarvis put him in Part 6. So yet, another sequel with Corpse Jason. The idea did bother me initially. The extra supernatural touch just kind of sounded so lame. Plus, they were so transparent about basically taking the Carrie-like character from Stephen King and having her here just to fight Jason. I don't know why the idea bothered me so much, honestly, but after watching it again, I enjoyed a lot about this one. Following sequels were scrapped with Tina's character, and I have to say, even though I kind of enjoyed this one, and the alternative ended up being the dreaded Jason Takes Manhattan, I didn't feel confident in having too many more sequels of this plot. I could have been surprised again, sure, but I think the plotline was the perfect length this time around. And the formula, I feel, would have gotten old quickly with Carrie versus Jason. With the story, I feel like it's at least a bit of an improvement with building our lead character, the backstory of her trauma, accidentally killing her alcoholic father when she was little and still unaware of her powers, the tension between her and her mother, but also with the doctor who's claiming to help her by bringing her back to her old home, trying to help her cope. But what he's really trying to do is exploit her powers for the benefits of his research and fame. And he is truly a deplorable character that made for another interesting antagonist. And as for the other characters, the teenagers in the nearest house, it's a Friday the 13th group. It's a group of 30-something-year-olds playing teenagers with the typical interest. But the Dr. Cruz character did help me to care more about Tina and her mom, especially when he uses her mom as a human fucking shield to distract Jason. Fucking rat bastard. But anyway, the film does annoyingly open with a recap of the final scene from Part 6. Too long, it's filler, but I've given my thoughts on this kind of thing already with other installments that I've already ranked, but I'll leave that there. The subplot next door is a planned surprise party for a friend named Michael. Him and his girlfriend Jane do not make it, though, as they become appetizers in Jason's killing party. Michael's death, in particular, was actually a great introduction to the aggressiveness and strength of this Jason. Also, maybe a little of his sense of humor, also. He throws a knife into Michael's back, and he recovers this knife by picking up Michael's body by the knife handle and just casually just shakes him off. So, happy birthday, Michael. Jason thought up his gift for you all on his own. And of course, we do have a love interest with Tina, a guy named Nick. We also, in each movie, seem to keep getting that one weird friend in each friend group. I guess for a little pizzazz or extra personality or something, I don't know. This time around, it's Eddie. And Eddie, to me, kind of looks like Ashton Kutcher playing Kelso from that 70s show. That is, until he starts talking. And it's about nothing but sci-fi shit. It's his entire personality, but, you know, he is miles better than Shelley from Part 3, for starters. We also get the iconic, or to Kane Hodder, the notorious sleeping bag kill, as a woman in the woods is with her man, and is killed by being slammed against a tree while trapped in a sleeping bag. I feel like you can also feel the frustration in the chosen take they use, as Hodder had to redo this scene multiple times to try and make it look as real as possible, and he really had to handle some heavy-ass padding. So I guess there are some drawbacks to being big and strong as hell, and really good at playing a serial killer. I guess the good thing about Jason X when he recreated this kill was he obviously had probably close to no padding that time around. I'm sure he either insisted or they just didn't care about the realism of it, I don't know. But even when some of the teen drama is lame and uninteresting, this film still has some of my favorite Jason moments, which again is largely why I place this film so much higher on my list. Plus the finale with Tina fighting him with her powers is actually kind of effective in a way. The kills with the couple in the van in particular were pretty brutal, with the sickening head compression followed by the other person's final breath being hilariously exhaled through the noisemaker they kept messing with before. One thing I did get tired of by this point is Jason's utilization of fucking windows. Jumping through windows, throwing a body out of a house through a window, throwing a body into a house through a window, grabbing somebody through a window. It was cool the first few times, but by part 7, come on. I will say though that the one window death that I kind of liked in a different kind of way was the Robin character after her sex scene. I found out after the fact that the way her death was shot was actually a reshoot, and entertainingly, it kind of shows. I don't know, just the way her body went through the window isn't that typical slow motion that you saw a lot in part 4, to suddenly regular speed, and then her body just awkwardly, like, face plants on the ground. And it went from this, like, intense music and that intense slow motion to just complete silence in her awkward positioning. I, I don't know, I just found myself really laughing at the conclusion of that moment. Yeah, otherwise, let's chill with the windows, guys. A couple of the deaths were nice, not in their originality, but because two of these people were just so unlikable. Dr. Cruz, of course, again. I loved it when he died. But also Melissa with her miserable mean girl bullshit. And Jason just kind of discards her across the room, killing her instantly that way. It's simple, yes, but also kind of effective for someone who demanded to be center of attention all the time. So to me, it worked. And with this Carrie vs. Jason showdown, it's definite 80s cheese, but still incredibly fun to watch. Much larger destruction of props and the set than many other installments. The trapping scene where Jason goes back to the bottom of the lake was different. Tina's dead father grabbing him and putting the chains back on him. And of course, there are some theories as to why he had absolutely no decomposition to his body, number one. And also why his body was still there when he definitely would have been pulled out by the police years ago. But originally, it was just due, I think, to poor writing, where the producers just hated the decayed makeup they tried to use. So instead, they went the route of just throwing some dirt on his face and calling it a day, which is just a dreadful fucking idea. The fans have actually gone with a different twist on it, which is that Tina's dead dad appears not as his physical body, but as a manifestation of Tina's powers. And with things like this unlocked, these new abilities, it might be a flimsy idea, but I can kind of buy it for the sake of this franchise. And with this new door open, I again could see maybe one sequel, maybe working out with Tina and Jason again. But I guess we'll never know anyway. They also tried once again to bring Jason and Freddy Krueger together, but failed to reach an agreement with New Line Cinema. John Carl Buechler was the director here. He often did special effects, but does actually a competent job in this new role. And with his history, he did effects for films in the past such as From Beyond, as well as for Hatchet. And no matter what you think of Hatchet, as controversial as that series is, something that was rarely lacking there were the special effects. And Daryl Haney and Manuel Fideo were the writers. Walt Gorney returned, not as Crazy Ralph this time around, unfortunately, but as a narrator. And why we needed a narrator all of a sudden, I couldn't tell you. But it's really cool to have the actor back in some way before his passing. And he also, down the road, tried to have a sequel that disregarded Jason Takes Manhattan and try the mental institution thing again, with Tina this time being blamed for the murders in this film, but it was not meant to be. So, Part 7 was rather refreshing and kept the momentum going overall from Part 6. It's one of the more exciting sequels with more rewatchability, some dumb, forgettable characters as you can expect, with not the most original ideas outside of the telekinetic aspect, but I'll still go with a 6.8 out of 10. And before I move on, one last little sidebar. Let's just acknowledge how fucking great 1988 was for horror. You had this film, you had A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, Halloween 4, the first Child's Play, Hellraiser 2, Phantasm 2. If I was alive at this point, I would have lost all my fucking money to the theaters. Sorry, I just wanted to appreciate that for a minute. But anyway, on to number 4. At number 4, I have Friday the 13th, Part 2. Just 1 year after the original, and against the wishes of a few prominent figures in that first film, we got our first sequel. And they just had no idea how far this was going to go. And many may disagree with me when it comes to how high I am placing the first two films on my list, But again, this is my opinion, and I will do my best to explain why this is my personal preference. Because with these films, you do feel that lower budget, and parts are definitely outdated. But overall, I like that these feel more subdued and more like suspenseful slashers, more classic slashers. Not that I didn't enjoy how over the top the franchise got, but when I rank them and think about what I would go back to first, this is just kind of where I stand. And don't get me wrong, Part 2 is still heavily flawed, but I felt more of the effort in crafting genuine scares, for the time in particular. With the characters in this film, we have more counselors trying to prepare to open a camp near Camp Crystal Lake, and this is supposed to take place 5 years after the original events. Jenny is our lead character and final girl here, and she's honestly one of my favorite, I have to say. And on the flip side, this was the first film to do that extended recap of the ending to the previous films, so this time around I was a little extra annoyed and caught off guard about that, but in this case, that was really the worst part overall. Alice, the lone survivor from part 1, we do get to see again briefly as she is in our cold open. And this recap scene is done as a nightmare Alice is having. And after our reminder of what happened in part 1, I do enjoy this cold open as a whole. I really actually hated to see Alice go, but between the actress's decision making and life events, and the studio wanting to apparently go in a new direction, she was killed off almost immediately. And this franchise really struggled to keep a consistent lead character, aside from Tommy Jarvis. This initial scene is actually a great example of why the first two films in particular kind of stand out in their own way. They had more moments where they just kind of took their time with the build up to an attack or a scare. Jason popping out expectantly every few minutes is fun in its own way, of course, but I found myself missing the slow burn moments as the franchise progressed. And with this opener, for example, you know something is coming, but when? And these first two films did shoot themselves in the foot with this sometimes, as there were moments where the scare that's coming was too obvious, so essentially you have this really boring build up that only leads to this lackluster reveal. So this formula was definitely not without error. But I just like that there was more balance with the decent scares and the brutal kills. We also get some nice misdirection with the scares. The first film was very POV heavy with the killer's perspective, and they kind of play with that some with Alice here. We almost get this corny, like, psycho shower kill scene, but then it kind of puts a twist on it by Alice just abruptly throwing open the curtain when the cameraman gets closer and gets out. There's also a mirror sequence like this later that's kind of a similar vibe of that misdirection. Although one jump scare type, including this scene, that was way overutilized in these first couple films, was cat jump scares. Like cats we've never seen before. They're nowhere else in the film, but just suddenly they gotta throw that cheap scare at you just to be another number, I guess. I don't know, I already don't like fake jump scares, but cat ones have always annoyed me for some reason. Just so cheap. But for part 2, they were made to tone down the gore actually from the first. And I actually knew this going into my most recent viewing, but I actually had forgotten about it along the way, and didn't really notice it hindering a lot of the kills. And they're not the most memorable kills in the franchise, but they were still effective, and I don't think the toning down the gore really impacted this movie in a negative way. And the hockey mask that Jason eventually gets is iconic, but there's still something about the bag mask Jason starts with in this one, and at the start of the 2009 remake, that kind of has its own charm as well. The film was really a nice introduction to Jason after having Mrs. Voorhees as the killer in the first. And the characters we get this time around are again characters. Jenny, she has a love interest named Paul. Jeff and Sandra are the couple who eventually go off and have sex before dying. Mark and Vicky are a little different, sort of, as Mark is in a wheelchair. And then you have Terry. Terry is the especially sexualized woman in this movie. But what's worse is she is stalked by Scott. And Jesus Christ, Scott. This man creeped me the fuck out. He probably creeped me out worse than Jason, almost. If the TV show You had been introduced at this time, instead of modern day, this motherfucker would have been a great Joe Goldberg. This is also our final Crazy Ralph appearance, which, again to me, is kind of sad for some reason. The goofiness of this character would have made some great brief appearances in later sequels. Another character I forgot about is Ted, who actually survives by staying out late away from the camp and partying instead. So that's kind of a comical twist on that trope. And Jason is really great here still. He's different, still not necessarily superhuman, and definitely not supernatural yet. Just kind of this roided out strength at most. And in my 2009 remake review, I mentioned liking Jason when he used to run occasionally, and we do get that here. And the kills again are decent enough, nothing really to write home about most of the time, but the pacing is really good. The writers are going to hell for, not necessarily for killing wheelchair bound Mark, but for having his body roll chaotically down this long ass flight of stairs with him still in the wheelchair most of the way. It's just, Jason doesn't discriminate. He has plenty of rage for everyone. We also get a fucked up transition of this little dog named Muffin who comes across Jason and barks up at him. And we don't see her die, but the editor transitions from Muffin barking at Jason to the counselors grilling hot dogs on a grill. That's just sick, man. Come on. The double kill with a spear going through both Jeff and Sandra at the same time was cool, actually. But what I enjoyed more was Vicky discovering this scene. The bed covers are pulled over two bodies. She approaches the bed expecting to find Jeff and Sandra, but instead we see Jeff hanging on the back of the door across the room. And then Jason rises up from under the covers next to Sandra. That's just a nice little switch, like a nice twist that I did not remember from my first viewing of this film. That's just a really cool Jason moment, honestly. Although the moment is followed up with a $5 quality POV stabbing of Vicky, but I can let that slide a little bit considering. We get the standard final cat and mouse showdown between Jenny and Jason, and sometimes Paul. Jason conveniently goes from this sturdy, collected, violent force to kind of a clumsy oaf, falling off chairs and letting Jenny squirm away after tackling her and things like that. But the action is decent as a whole. She makes dumb choices here and there, but that's typical. What are you gonna do? But an iconic shot that I really enjoyed from this film in particular that stuck with me is Jenny in Jason's shack when she discovers it, and you see her looking around trying to figure out what to do. But then out the window behind her, you see Jason charging up at her, and it's just a great shot to me, a great frame. The reveal of Mrs. Voorhees' head being in that shack with her sweater still was really creepy also, but then you get that addition of Jenny putting on her old sweater, trying to distract and confuse Jason. But besides that, the ending of these initial films were still a little frustrating after the first film, with the same trope. The lead character dreams of escaping or waiting on help, and then Pamela or Jason grabs them, and then they wake up on a hospital stretcher or in a hospital. It just got really annoying really quickly, and just shows less creativity. I just feel like there's different avenues they could have gone down that they just refused to. So especially by part 3, they really should have tried something completely different, I think. But part 2 has a lot that I would come back to. That classic 80s slasher feel with a great villain. Warrington Gillette was actually credited at the time, more so playing Jason, but apparently most of the stunts by Jason were actually done by Steve Dash, who was uncredited here. But apparently Steve Dash came back in part 3 for part of the time, and they kind of made up for it with the credits. I'm not really sure. I also hate that Tom Savini didn't return to do more with makeup and special effects outside of the first and fourth films. But like Betsy Palmer and Sean S. Cunningham, they were just so slow to come around to being fully on board with Jason coming up as the villain. But one last note before my rating, I am so fucking happy that the name is Jason and not Josh. Apparently that name was an option at one point, but no. No. Fuck no. So thank you apparently to Victor Miller for that save. But that's it for this part. I'll go with a 7 out of 10 for part 2. So now we're in the top 3. And my top 3 spot may be particularly controversial, as like many others, I really expected to follow suit in saying that this film is completely outdated, but I was surprised this time around. So my number 3 spot goes to the OG 1980 film that started it all, Friday the 13th. Growing up watching other installments in this series, and Freddy vs. Jason, it for some reason took me a while to watch this one. And I actually learned from Scream first that Pamela Voorhees was the killer in this one and not Jason. And the lack of Jason, I'm sure, is largely why people don't rewatch this one as much or don't like it as much. But I actually still surprisingly got a good bit out of it. Don't get me wrong, a lot of aspects of this film do feel a bit cheaper and more basic than a lot of the later sequels. The POV shots were cool in places of the killer before their kills, but it does become overutilized very quickly. And a lot of this was likely due to budgetary constraints, as no one seemed to realize how successful this film would be. Jason was the better option for the long-term killer of the franchise, but here, Betsy Palmer absolutely nails this role as the unhinged, psychotic mother who never recovered from her son's death. Too bad she thought this film was shit. But that didn't stop her from making a terrifying performance just look so easy. And while the film is dated and formulaic in a lot of ways with the camera work and the acting, I liked how atmospheric it felt, even in its simplicity and design. And it still feels inventive in places, again with Mrs. Voorhees' personality in the end, and even a couple of the kills here and there. Also, Tom Savini handled a lot of the makeup and the special effects, so you can definitely expect some greatness in that department. Jack's death, the character that Kevin Bacon plays, is hands down the most chilling kill in the entire movie to me. Watching it again, I knew it was coming, but the timing still caught me off guard a bit. The under the bed kill is especially horrifying and enough to make you paranoid. When I was younger, I actually went to a summer camp in North Georgia that honestly reminded me a lot of Camp Crystal Lake. Too bad sequels way overutilized this kill in one form or another. And while that became a bit annoying, I still really liked it this first time around. It was really inventive for the time. And too bad Savini felt similar to Betsy Palmer and Sean S. Cunningham at the time in feeling that this should be a standalone slasher. But this story is, of course, a group of camp counselors prepping Camp Crystal Lake for a reopening since the slaying of a few counselors in 1958. Steve Christy is the man in charge, but Alice is ultimately the main character. We actually get a nice twist on this, as Annie appears to be set up for the lead role at first, the counselor who was hitchhiking and fails to make it to the camp. And she's actually killed off before making it. And I thought this actually was a nice touch, like a nice twist, because they did make it abundantly clear who the main focus would be, who the least disposable character would be, for a good bit of the film. And even the killer, if you've never heard of this movie or seen it before, it actually does seem like a nice mystery trying to figure out who the killer might be. I had also forgotten about Crazy Ralph and him being a suspect with all his doomsday rants and him even popping out of the cafeteria pantry right before riding off on his bike. This movie was originally meant to be a standalone film, once again. They did not anticipate at all the extent of the success they would get, and they were even self-aware of ripping on the success of Halloween, which I imagine made slashers more desirable in cinema. And several of those involved just needed a paycheck. And Victor Miller also admitted to putting a twist on the Psycho formula, just by having the mother actually be the killer this time around. It's just incredible what this all started, especially when a lot of the crew involved over the years just completely shat on these movies. And when it comes to rewatchability, it's definitely not for how many of the kills were handled, because aside from the Kevin Bacon death, the rest are pretty standard, lackluster, low-budget 70s to 80s slasher kills. Some slit throats, and probably way too many off-screen kills. Some off-screen kills are okay, especially with the lacking budget, but I just feel they should have tried harder to have a more on-screen ones, considering the subgenre. When Bill goes to check on the generator at one point when the power goes out and Alice follows him soon after, we see him hanging on the back of the door. And again, that is actually a decent surprise the first time around, and even in part 2, with Jeff being hung on the back of the door in the bedroom. But again, too many of the sequels followed suit with this and kind of ruined it later. But it's pretty nice here. And while the characters are still your run-of-the-mill slasher characters, there was still some entertainment with the build-up to the action, with some of their banter, some of their personalities, which has worked some of the sequels and their characters. And I was actually amused by the scene where they find a snake in one of the cabins. They're just arguing over who's going to get it and how. And then we even get this dumbass recommendation to call the snake over to them. And someone is basically the audience and asking, how do you call a snake? And I'm sorry, it's just a stupid point to make. I'm sure it's a forgettable scene for most people. But if you're going to have these filler scenes in slasher films to get you to 80 to 90 minutes, it's amusing enough. Starting even with this first movie in the franchise, similar to John Carpenter, Sean S. Cunningham also tried to argue against the trope in horror films that sex leads to death and only the innocent are spared. And clearly that's been parodied a lot over the years, and people really did not get that from these iconic slashers. They thought the exact opposite, but they really tried here to get that point across. And with this first Friday the 13th, it's actually a decent attempt. Because Alice, our lead character, is never nude, never has sex on screen, but she does smoke pot. She agrees to play strip Monopoly with a couple of the other counselors, and has even referenced past relationships before, so she's not completely innocent in the traditional sense. And when it comes to characters dying after sex, with Carpenter and with Cunningham, they really try to swing death after sex as just good people dying for no good reason at all, and it's all meant to just make the killer look more ruthless. They really tried, but unfortunately, people kind of interpreted it differently, and that includes creators of these franchises down the road. But I did really love how the score was utilized in particular in this film and the next film. Horror films have a bad habit of having this loud, abrasive score that abruptly ends right before a scare, like literally right before one, and it has ruined a lot of moments. And especially the Conjuring universe is a universe I want to like, but they keep having a lot of moments like that, so they ruin a lot of their suspense. But Harry Manfredini was the composer of probably the majority of these films, if not all of them, and he really does a great job in the beginning in particular. He would have the score end suddenly into silence, but that did not always lead to a scare, even if it looked like it would. And on the flip side, I actually liked the absence of a score that they had a lot of moments, and it would be absent for an extended period of time, and it kind of created a similar effect, really ramping up that suspense. And also, of course, you can't talk about these films without giving Manfredini a shout out and some credit for the iconic sound that is just so brilliant and unique. The jump scares still aren't perfect, especially in this first film versus maybe some of the second. And some do fall into these cheap tropes, but the suspense, the atmosphere, it's just overall so much more effective in some ways in these first couple films. A complaint I do have at times with this film in particular is the lighting. Overuse of lighting in what's supposed to be a dark setting has ruined a lot of horror films as well, but this time around, there are moments in this 1980 film, with a finale in particular, that I couldn't see shit. And it was just impossible to make out what was happening, and for the finale and the big final showdown, I feel like it's a bad time to have terrible lighting. And budget, I'm sure, caused this issue more than anything else. That didn't make it less frustrating at times. Another complaint, I guess, would be the more noticeable ABC progression with characters here. Splitting up for no good reason, no one even begins to show any fight in them until Alice meets Mrs. Voorhees. Mrs. Voorhees doesn't struggle with anybody else until she meets Alice. And I guess maybe you could argue that her antics and her torturing of Alice more so could be her just having more fun with the final victim, and it just all went wrong when she was caught off guard. But I feel like she still did not show that similar strength to her other kills. But hey, that's horror, that's the budget, this is our main protagonist. It's gonna happen. And Alice, of course, makes dumb decisions like a lot of the other characters, but some are especially baffling. But unless I'm missing something, let me know, but I could have sworn the Jeep was easily accessible to drive away, but she's one of the dead counselors in the back seat, and she just abandons it and runs away. Like, I believe she could have just driven that shit away. Like, yeah, you got a dead body in the back seat, but it's better than being fucking killed. And then soon after that, she actually knocks out Mrs. Voorhees briefly with a pan, but she neglects to pick up her machete that she dropped, and she just runs off without a weapon. Other than that, I did enjoy the final showdown overall between Alice and Mrs. Voorhees. The final fight was kind of cool with the slow motion decapitation of Mrs. Voorhees. That is still very iconic. But even before that, one of my favorite editing choices, or one of my favorite directing choices, was when you see Mrs. Voorhees charging at Alice from behind, but you only see this in the reflection of the lake water. It has to be one of my favorite shots from the franchise here. That was a really cool moment. And it's probably the only time I really enjoyed the dream sequence with the ending. Alice being grabbed by a young deformed Jason and brought into the lake before waking up in a hospital. It's actually the first time around a really great twist and a nice note to leave off on before the credits roll. Nothing else with this origin film, you have to give it once again to Betsy Palmer, if nothing else, with a haunting and demented performance. Split personality, deranged, the best performance by far in this film. But Friday the 13th has some fun surprises and a uniqueness to it despite other flaws. I can definitely understand how it achieved its success, especially at the time. And I was genuinely shocked at how much more I enjoyed it this time around. So I'll give part 1 a 7.2 out of 10.